The last hope. The stars were no longer the beacons of hope they had once been. The endless expanse of space, which had once been a canvas of possibilities, now felt like a vast, unforgiving void. Admiral Canar Friss stood motionless before the tactical display on the command bridge of the warship Eternal Vigilance. The image projected before him was a bleak, haunting reminder of the decimation of his people. Once, the Carians had ruled the galaxy with an alliance of 17 species, their civilization a shining example of cooperation, peace, and progress. Now, they were on the brink of extinction. His bright purple skin, once a symbol of his pride and strength, had taken on a dull, ashen tone, an involuntary sign of his growing despair. Around him, his officers moved like shadows, their eyes vacant with the same resignation. They had been fighting for what felt like forever, struggling to hold back the tide of destruction that was the Voidborn Collective. These creatures, this hive-minded force, consumed everything in their path. Entire star systems had fallen. Civilizations had been reduced to ashes. The Carians' once mighty fleets had been obliterated, and all their weapons had proven useless against the Voidborn's adaptive shielding. Every effort had failed. Every strategy had crumbled. "Admiral," Lieutenant Zia's voice broke through the heavy silence, her tone barely audible over the hum of the failing ship's systems. "Another outpost has fallen. The Voidborn have completely overrun the SNIS sector." Friss's fist clenched involuntarily at his side. The Voidborn's relentless assault was not just a military action. It was a campaign of eradication. They didn't just defeat their enemies. They consumed them. Organic matter was absorbed, repurposed, and turned into more of them. What had once been a thriving system of planets, civilizations, and life forms now lay barren, consumed by an unstoppable force. How long until they reached the core worlds? Friss asked, though he already knew the answer. Zia's 3 eyes blinked rapidly in distress. At current trajectories, less than 30 cycles. Friss turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the war council that had gathered at the far side of the bridge. The leaders of the remaining Carian Alliance species looked back at him, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. Some of them bore the features of creatures with mandibles or tentacles, while others had no recognizable human traits at all. Yet, despite their diversity, they all shared the same expression, a recognition that their time was running out. "We have lost another 2 fleets at the Prion defensive line," Friss announced, his voice steady, though tinged with frustration. "Our weapons barely penetrate their adaptive shielding. Our best minds cannot decipher their quantum-entangled communications. We are running out of options." Silence enveloped the room once again, but this time, it was an oppressive kind of silence, one that carried the weight of inevitability. Friss knew that the Council's decision was fast approaching. They would have to choose between fighting on with their dwindling resources or accepting the cold truth that they were facing annihilation. Counselor Vex, an ancient Morgan with crystal-like growths protruding from his exoskeleton, leaned forward, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "Perhaps it is time we consider the unthinkable, Admiral." A murmur rippled through the council. Friss narrowed his eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "The humans," Vex said, almost in a whisper, but his words carried a weight that sent a ripple through the room. "There are ancient records that speak of them. A species so fierce, so unpredictable, that our ancestors sealed off an entire sector of the galaxy to avoid them. But perhaps, just perhaps, they are our only hope." The mention of humans sent a shudder through the room. They were a myth, a legend from the dark ages of space exploration. Most believed they had either gone extinct or devolved into primitive savagery on their isolated worlds. Yet Vex spoke with a certainty that unsettled Friss. It was a certainty that suggested Vex believed there was more to this legend than just ancient tales. "What are you saying, Vex?" demanded Ithil, a diplomat from the Gritan species, her iridescent feathers bristling with indignation. "That we should summon the very species that once terrorized our ancestors. That we should wake them from their slumber. They fought the Voidborn once before," Vex countered, his voice firm. And they survived. I have the coordinates. I have the frequencies. We can reach them. Frisk turned back to the tactical display, his mind racing. The idea seemed preposterous. Humans had been a myth for millennia. Their violent past, their unpredictable nature, their complete isolation. How could they be the key to salvation? But at this point, he realized they had nothing left to lose. We've tried everything else, Frisk said, his voice tinged with desperation. If there is even the slightest chance that humans still exist, that they might help us, we must take it. The council members exchanged nervous glances, uncertainty clouding their expressions. Some feared what the reawakening of such a species might bring, an even greater threat than the Voidborn. Others dismissed the notion as fantasy. We must act, Frisk declared, his voice growing stronger. Retrieve the ancient coordinates. Rebuild the signal. If there is any chance of salvation, we must take it. The debate raged on for hours, but in the end, it was desperation that drove the council to make the decision. The coordinates were found, buried deep within the ancient archives. The communication team, led by Zia, worked tirelessly to reconstruct the signal. The task was monumental, but they had no choice. If they were to survive, this was their last hope. The message they sent was simple, yet heavy with the weight of their desperation. This is the Kalian Alliance. We face extinction at the hands of the Voidborn Collective. If humanity still exists, if you remember the stars, we beg for your aid. With a final, resolute click, the transmission was sent. The fate of the Kalian species now rested in the hands of a long-forgotten, mythic race, a race whose response could change everything. The reply that changed everything. The transmission had been sent. The message was now out in the endless dark void of space, traveling across light years toward a distant and forgotten world. Admiral Kanar Frisk stood by the holographic projection, watching the trajectory of the message as it journeyed through the vast emptiness. He could feel the weight of the moment in the air around him. This was it. They had no other option. If the humans, these mythical beings, did not respond, the end was inevitable. They had already lost so much. To lose hope now would mean the complete and final collapse of everything they had built. But time was running out. Frisk's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, the constant strain of leadership and the unending fight against the Voidborn taking its toll. He had been a leader for decades, guiding the Kalian Alliance through difficult battles and harsh negotiations. But this was different. This was desperation. The War Council had dispersed hours ago, leaving Frisk alone with his thoughts. The council members, all of them leaders of ancient species who had once ruled the stars, had agreed that the message to humanity was their only hope. Yet even as they had agreed, doubt lingered in the air like an unspoken word. How could they trust in the legends? How could they rely on a species that, if the stories were true, had once been so volatile and dangerous? Frisk didn't know. He had no answers. But he did know one thing. If the humans were real, if they were out there, they had to be their last hope. He couldn't afford to think about the consequences of failure. Days passed with no response. The crew of the Eternal Vigilance continued their vigil, waiting for some sign, some signal that humanity had received their plea. Zia, the lieutenant who had helped reconstruct the transmission, remained at her post, tirelessly monitoring every incoming signal. The warship, once a symbol of the Kalian Alliance's might, now felt like a tomb, its walls closing in with every passing moment. Then, on the fourth day after the transmission, something happened. A sudden pulse of energy shot through the ship's communications array, causing the lights to flicker. The tactical display buzzed to life, and for a brief moment, Frisk thought he was imagining things. But then he saw it. A new transmission. A response. It was faint, barely perceptible against the cosmic background noise. But it was there. Frisk was at the communication console in an instant, his hand shaking with a mix of anticipation and disbelief. Zia's voice broke the tension as she worked to stabilize the signal. "Admiral, We're receiving something. It's a message. Weak, but it's coming through. Friss leaned over her shoulder, watching as the broken transmission slowly pieced itself together. The words, once fractured, began to form a coherent message. This is Earth. We hear you. And we remember. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that none of them had expected. Friss's heart raced. Earth. The humans. They existed. They were real. And they had received the message. Zaya quickly began decoding the rest of the transmission. The message continued, each word clearer than the last. It was a response, a promise. We remember the stars, and we have not forgotten how to fight. The room fell silent. Every officer, every leader on the bridge, stared at the screen, their eyes wide in disbelief. The Kalian Alliance had sent a plea, and humanity had responded. But there was more. The final part of the message sent a chill through Friss's bones. This is Commander Lena Wills of the Terran Federation. We are coming. Prepare yourselves. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving the crew of the Eternal Vigilance in stunned silence. Commander Lena Wills. The Terran Federation. Earth. The humans, it seemed, were not only real. They were preparing to respond. Friss struggled to process what had just occurred. For years, they had heard nothing of humanity. They had assumed that the human race had either died off or evolved into something unrecognizable. The very idea that Earth, that humanity, had not only survived but had thrived, was almost too much to comprehend. What had they become in all these years? And how could they, with their once violent past, help the Kalian Alliance now? Zaya was the first to speak, her voice a mix of awe and caution. Admiral, are we sure? This could be a trap, a trick of some kind. Friss turned to her, his face set in determination. If they wanted to destroy us, they would have done it already. No, they're coming to help. But we must be ready. We need to prepare for their arrival, whatever it may mean. In the days that followed, the Eternal Vigilance and the remaining fleet of the Kalian Alliance scrambled to prepare for the arrival of humanity's forces. The message from Earth had been received, but what did it mean? Who were these humans? What had they become? And could they truly be the salvation the Kalian Alliance needed? As the warship's engines hummed to life, Friss could feel a strange sense of hope stirring within him, something he hadn't felt in years. The Voidborn were still out there, relentlessly tearing through the galaxy, but now they had a chance, a real chance. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Friss allowed himself to believe in something, that the legends were true. That humanity, the very species once feared and isolated by the Kalian ancestors, would come to their aid. And so, with a message from Earth hanging in the air and a fleet of human ships on their way, Friss stood at the helm of the Eternal Vigilance, staring out into the stars. The battle was far from over. But now, for the first time in what seemed like forever, they had hope. The arrival. The weeks stretched on like an eternity. Time, once a steady companion, now felt like an enemy, dragging its feet as the Eternal Vigilance hurtled toward the coordinates that humanity had provided. Friss stood once again before the tactical display, his eyes tracing the movements of the remaining fleet as it followed behind. The Kalian Alliance was no longer a vast, powerful coalition. It was a shell of its former self. But now, at least, there was a glimmer of hope. For the first time in what felt like ages, the warship's crew worked with renewed energy. Officers moved briskly across the bridge, conducting their usual duties, but there was an air of anticipation that had never been there before. They were no longer facing a hopeless death march into oblivion. Now, they were waiting for something, someone, humanity. Despite the excitement, a sense of unease still lingered in the depths of Friss's mind. The humans had responded to their message, yes, but what would they be like? Were they still the violent, unpredictable species from the old stories? Or had they evolved into something more civilized, something that would be willing to join forces with the Kalian Alliance? Friss had no way of knowing, but one thing was certain. Humanity's involvement would change everything. Frisk turned to Zia, who had been monitoring the communication array more closely than anyone else. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, scanning for any signs of an approaching fleet. For days now, they had received no new messages, but Frisk could feel the weight of expectation in the air. They had no idea when the humans would arrive, but every passing moment brought them closer. Then, without warning, the sensors on the Eternal Vigilance came alive. The ship's alarms blared, and the quiet tension in the command center erupted into a flurry of activity. Zia's voice rang out across the bridge, sharp and clear. "Admiral, we've detected incoming ships. They're massive." Frisk's heart skipped a beat. He moved quickly to Zia's station, his breath catching in his throat. The readout on the screen showed a fleet of ships, their signatures unmistakable. There was no mistaking it now. Humanity had arrived. But the size and scale of the fleet were far beyond what Frisk had imagined. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of ships, each one dwarfed even the largest Kalian warships. "They're coming in fast," Zia added, her fingers flying over the controls as she tried to stabilize the readings. "And they're not hiding their presence. They want us to know they're here." The atmosphere on the bridge shifted instantly from anxious anticipation to tense focus. The crew moved like a well-oiled machine, activating the ship's defensive systems and preparing for whatever might come next. But despite their readiness, Frisk could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what to expect from the humans. Would they be allies, or had they come to finish what the Voidborn had started? Yes. The human fleet drew closer. Frisk's mind raced. He had read all the ancient texts and heard the stories, but nothing had prepared him for the sight before him. The ships were unlike anything he had ever seen, sleek, sharp, and powerful, their designs unmistakably human. They were a force to be reckoned with. But Frisk couldn't help but wonder, how had the humans achieved such power? How had they rebuilt themselves into this advanced civilization after so many years of isolation? A few moments later, a transmission came through, cutting through the static and noise of the communication systems. The voice that greeted Frisk was clear, firm, and unwavering. "This is Commander Lena Wills of the Terran Federation. Admiral Frisk, we've received your message. We are here to assist. Prepare to receive our reinforcements." Frisk's mind swirled with questions, but the immediate one was clear. What kind of reinforcements were they speaking of? The human fleet was massive, and their presence could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. But the unknown was a heavy burden to bear. As the transmission ended, Frisk motioned for his crew to continue their preparations. They had no time for further questions. What mattered now was the arrival of the human forces. Within moments, the Eternal Vigilance began to receive the first of the human ships. One by one, massive Terran vessels dropped out of hyperspace, their engines thrumming with power as they maneuvered into position. The sight was staggering. Humanity had arrived in full force. But Frisk had no way of knowing just how formidable these reinforcements truly were. The Voidborn were relentless, and despite the overwhelming presence of humanity's fleet, Frisk couldn't shake the lingering doubt. Would it be enough? "Admiral," Zia called out once more, her voice tense. "The humans are hailing us. They're requesting to establish a direct communication link." Frisk nodded quickly. "Put them through." A moment later, the screen flickered, and the face of Commander Lena Wills appeared in front of them. Her expression was calm, but there was a fire in her eyes, a determination that was unmistakable. She didn't look like the kind of person to be intimidated by anything, least of all an ancient galactic threat like the Voidborn. "Admiral Frisk," she began, her voice unwavering, "we are here to fight with you. The Terran Federation has been preparing for this day for a long time. The Voidborn are a threat to all life, and we will not stand by while they destroy everything we've worked to protect." Frisk couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. The humans weren't just here to watch. They were here to fight. They were allies, partners in this desperate struggle. But still, questions swirled in his mind. How could they have known so much about the Voidborn? How had they prepared for this battle in isolation, so far from the Kalian alliance? "We're grateful for your aid, Commander," Friss replied, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "But we've been fighting the Voidborn for years. We have little left. What can you offer that we haven't already tried?" Commander Wills's eyes narrowed slightly. "We don't just fight with ships and weapons, Admiral. We fight with strategy, ingenuity, and a fierce determination to protect what's ours. We have advanced technology and tactics you haven't seen before. Together, we will break the Voidborn's grip on this galaxy." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a promise that was impossible to ignore. Humanity had not just come to fight, they had come to win. And with their reinforcements now fully integrated into the Kalian fleet, Friss knew that the battle for the galaxy was about to enter a new phase. The Voidborn had no idea what was coming.